Kicking us off, what would have been all the way from Toronto, Canada, is Alison Walden from Share. And turn it over to you.
Thanks, Rob. Can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, Alison, you're coming through loud and clear. Thanks.
Oh, amazing. Thank you so much, Rob. I was having some technical issues earlier, so I wasn't sure if this was going to work. All right. Okay. Hey, everyone. My name's Alison Walden. I'm the accessibility lead at Publicis Sapient, and we're just sort of an enormous agency that makes websites and applications for enterprise-level companies usually. And I've spent the majority of the last 2 years helping to institutionalize accessibility at one of the world's top 10 largest automakers. So that's Fiat Chrysler Automobiles. And I'm really excited to share what I've learned with everyone today. So thanks for joining my session, and I really hope that we can get through this with no connectivity issues. So my key 2 learnings from the past 2.5 years, and what I'm hoping you'll take away with you today, are that no person or organization wants to exclude people from accessing content based on how they access it. This is just what ends up happening. And today, what I'm going to walk through is a 10-step process that I think can enable organizations to enable teams to just create that accessible content by default. So here are some automotive company slogans. Automotive companies seem to incorporate ideas of inclusivity and flexibility into their slogans, but unfortunately, not necessarily their websites. So here are some, drive your way, Hyundai, a car for everyone, and from my client's brand, Alfa Romeo, and I like this one, beauty is not enough. And this is also true for websites. Websites can't just be aesthetically pleasing. They also have to work for everyone. So I'm going to share a mildly depressing overview of automotive website accessibility a little bit later on. I'm happy to say, though, that my automotive client is different. They've put a real focus on web accessibility for the past 2.5 years. So the agency I work for, Publicis Sapient, built their web experience back in 2016, and it includes a large component library with themed components that are shared across 6 brands. So this is the huge web experience that we needed to remediate that we've been working on for the past 2.5 years. And if you look at the challenge by numbers, there were over 1,600 web pages, between 120 and 500 components, depending on how you define a component from a technology perspective. There are 6 brands or themes, so the same components are reused across all of the different brands, so Dodge and Jeep and Chrysler, etc. But they just have different CSS styles so that they can look specific to that brand. Our release schedule is monthly. Our team size fluctuated, but it's generally over 100 people. And their initial accessibility score, and I'm going to get to how I arrived at that score a little bit later on, was 44%. So I want to emphasize that low initial accessibility score wasn't intentional. It just happened because no processes were in place to enable the teams to create accessible content or for the client themselves to recognize an accessible experience. So everybody made mistakes. So here's a picture of a kid sticking his tongue on a frozen pole while his friend watches in fascination. Okay, I wish that the top organizational accessibility mistakes were as easy for most people to recognize as this mistake. So as Rob mentioned, I'm Canadian, and pretty much any Canadian is going to wince when they see this picture because they know it's not going to end well. That kid is going to be crying with his tongue stuck to the metal pole. But half the time in my role, I'm the kid in the picture who's looking on with fascination as companies, our clients, try to launch accessible experiences when they're making every single mistake in the book. Here are some of the top organizational accessibility mistakes. I'm sure that most of us will recognize all of these. So number 1, leaving accessibility until the end. Number 2, nobody on the team has ever used a keyboard or screen reader to navigate. Number 3, the client has nobody on their team to validate if an experience is accessible or not. Number 4, there's no keyboard or screen reader requirements documented. The whole documentation is centered around mouse pointer users. Number 5, there's nothing in the timeline to account for accessibility testing by project phase, which takes time. And then number 6, and I always think maybe I should put this at the top, a lack of diversity on teams. I like to start off my accessibility presentations by asking, would you ask someone who's only ever driven a car to design the perfect bike? Of course not. They wouldn't be considered qualified. But that's what we're asking our creative and technical teams to do if we're asking them to design and develop an accessible website when they've never navigated with a keyboard or screen reader or studied any aspect of web accessibility. The challenge for most people creating digital experiences today truly is that they are not qualified. And I'm not blaming them for that because they're being set up to fail. I've heard my team members say, hey, I wasn't taught this in school. I don't know what to do. Nobody said I needed to know that to work here. This wasn't part of my onboarding. These are really common things, and they're real challenges, and then it turns into, well, I thought someone else was doing the accessibility part of it. Everything that we're doing is done on Amazon, or insert any, big popular website in there. So it's fine, right? They just think that because they've seen it done that way before, it should be fine. Or they just think, you know what, it's going to be fine. Optimists. Unqualified people have a lot of wrong assumptions. So I've captured here some of the top web accessibility misconceptions of unqualified people. Number 1, they think that assistive technology users need or want a completely different experience. Number 2, they think that the beauty of the design is necessarily going to be impacted by adding accessibility features or removing barriers. Number 3, they think that creating an experience with accessibility features is going to take 2 to 3 times as long. Number 4, they assume that nobody's going to use all of these features anyway. And number 5, they think that web developers alone can make a website accessible. Unqualified people create internal tension on teams. They show inaccessible designs to the client with no internal review for accessibility. They don't take the opportunity to guide the clients to an accessible solution in design sessions. So what I'm talking about is, how do we get to a place where we're all on the same side? Because that's what this talk is about. I think we're all already on the same side and we just don't know it. I believe that nobody wants to exclude people from accessing content based on how they access it, and that web accessibility will happen naturally when it's built into existing processes. So here are the 10 steps that we're going to race through today, and we really are going to just race through these. Number 1, appeal to whatever aspect of web accessibility that moves your audience. So this is to pique someone's interest, pique your client's interest if they're not thinking about it already. Get them interested. Then number 2, perform an immersive accessibility audit. I'm going to talk about what I mean by an immersive audit. Number 3, super critical, provide screen reader training for the whole team across disciplines and the client, and do this first. Do this before you do anything else. Number 4, provide targeted web accessibility training by discipline after you've taught the screen reader training. Number 5, I'm going to talk about how to workshop your web accessibility remediation phase, so you're not just sort of fixing things in the background. Number 6, I'm going to talk about how critical it is to define accessibility ownership internally and on client teams. Number 7, set up processes to empower teams to test accessibility at each project phase. Number 8, how to maintain a living accessibility issue backlog. Number 9, I'm going to talk about regular mandatory training and what we did on FCA, on my FCA project. And number 10, help the client set up a regular cadence for site-wide automated and manual testing. So let's just jump right into this. Number 1, appeal to whatever aspect of accessibility that moves your audience. You're going to see some glamour shots of my clients' amazing vehicles as I'm going through this presentation. So here are some examples of benefits of web accessibility that may resonate with your clients. There are so many benefits of web accessibility, right? It's the right thing to do. It increases the user base, the competition's doing it, and they can avoid lawsuits. When I say it's the right thing to do, I mean from a human rights perspective, but it's also the only way to actually do something correctly, in my opinion. And it's always good to do our work in a correct manner. For my automotive client, I was asked to do a competitive analysis, and that's what started us off on our journey to a more accessible web experience. Since I did that, since that time, I do smaller versions of this for all my clients, whether they ask for it or not, because I've found that it's an awesome way to get clients interested in making their web experience accessible. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to do that. First of all, you have to find your client's competitors. I used an enterprise intelligence website. I used craft.co, but there are a whole bunch of them out there to just get a list of who their competitors are. Next, I devised a scorecard. So this is a methodology that you can use to test. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about this further on. I used a test that I made myself that tested for accessibility indicators. And number 3, you want to chart your results. So you want to test all the websites against your scorecard and then show your client the results. Now, just a note here, I'm just going to take a sip of water. There's no silver bullet. I think we all know, probably everyone on this call knows, that there's no bulletproof way to get an exact accessibility score for a web experience. An automated tool is only going to catch about 30% of the issues. My scorecard that I made tested for accessibility indicators. So it measured for the presence of key accessibility features and it measured the lack of key accessibility barriers. And what makes it strong is that I use the same test over and over again. So here's a really high-level overview of what my test consists of. You can access this deck later. I mentioned that I test against the top 10 most common accessibility issues that I encounter in testing. I have that in the appendix in case anyone's interested, but I'm just going to gloss over this now. So, I say this is one idea. This is how I did the competitive analysis for my clients' competitors. So 90% of the score focused on manual accessibility testing. So I used my keyboard and screen reader, and I tested those top 10 most common accessibility issues that I find when I do testing. And then only 10% of the score was on these other 3 things. Automated accessibility test scores. Listen, I know it's tempting because they pop out a number at the end, but I've seen an automated accessibility test score of 0 errors or 100% when that page is completely inaccessible. So we can't really rely on them for much, but I do put them in there because they test for code issues. I also look for external web accessibility acknowledgements on the websites. So this is easy to find content offering support with accessibility related issues or access to a web accessibility policy. Kind of ironic, sometimes I go into these web accessibility pages on websites and those pages are not accessible. So I go in and test those pages as well. And then I also test for internal web accessibility acknowledgements. So evidence internally in the organization that they're dedicated to accessibility. So if they have an accessibility lead that I can find on LinkedIn, then I'll give them a few points for that. And I will say there is a correlation, and I guess it's probably not surprising. Organizations who have an accessibility lead have more accessible websites. So maybe that's the first tip for your clients, is to hire one of those people. Okay, so here, without further ado, here are the automotive web accessibility competitive analysis results for all of the automotive companies that I tested. You can see the automotive companies are down the left side there. FCA is 4th from the bottom, and you can look at kind of, I have a chart version, and I have kind of a table version underneath that to express the data. The white bars are for 2020 and the black bars are for the initial test that I did in 2018. Okay, so you can see in 2018, most automotive companies failed. So in 2018 they failed. In 2020, the results have improved significantly, but most companies still score lower than a D. So we can see most of the companies are still falling in here between 50 and 60%. So in 2018, my client FCA scored 43% on this test. And in 2020, when I did this just a couple months ago, they scored 95%. So it's such a significant improvement for them. Now, just a reminder, this doing this accessibility indicator test is not the same as doing a full audit. I did not fully audit all of these sites, but I have found that my test is a great way to show sort of a representation of how accessible a website is. So a lot of people ask me, what happened when you told FCA back in 2018 that their site only gets a 43% score. So relaying bad news. It can definitely be tough for your client to digest that initial low grade. And I have some strategies to deal with that. You know, when you go into the meeting and tell them their low score, just stay positive, focus on all the possibilities for the future. Don't dwell on how things were done in the past. Come to that meeting with some quick wins that are achievable, you know, just some easy things that they could fix by the next release that are going to have a significant impact for their users. Anything that you can suggest. Highlight any accessibility features already present. So it's like, hey, you know what? You got a 43%, but at least all your alt attributes are just done really well. And also, it helps to refer to accessibility compliance as a testable requirement, because when you talk about it in that way, they remember that they knew of all the requirements and they tested to make sure all the requirements are met, but they didn't test this one. So they know that it's not just that your company didn't do it right, it's that they didn't test for that either. So that can be important. This is kind of fun and inspirational. Your client doesn't always have to ask you to do this for you to make an improvement on their website. I discovered that one of the development teams working on another automotive website at my company had been slowly improving the accessibility of their components, and they had significantly improved the accessibility of all their new and enhanced components simply because they refused to code things the wrong way. So this was a team of developers who know about accessibility requirements, and this team kind of made that appeal to the client by force. Okay, and it's possible to do that if you get enough people in the team to do their jobs, kind of back to what I was saying before, to do their jobs correctly, right? As long as you've enabled them through training to know what that means. Okay, so this is the end of section 1, appealing to whatever aspect of accessibility moves your audience. I'm going to move on to section 2, performing an immersive accessibility audit. Okay, so now you've piqued your client's interest enough, hopefully, for them to get an accessibility audit done. You don't want to just do the audit, you want to do it in an immersive way. We're going to talk about 3 ways to make your audit go further by using internal team members, recycling the audit results, and hopefully augmenting your team. So I usually get a front-end developer to be the main auditor because they're able to provide remediation suggestions in every area. Just due to the nature of their expertise, they know a lot about all of the disciplines that are ahead of them because they have to build the experience. But you can assign secondary auditors. So for the FCA audit, I assigned creative team members and trained them to recognize specific types of accessibility issues within their discipline. So I trained a group of writers on how to write proper alt attributes, and I assigned them the audit to check out all the alt attributes on the website. I assigned another group heading levels, and I taught them about how headings were supposed to be used, and then I taught the visual designers about contrast issues. So the benefits of doing this are multiple. If you assign the audit to the internal team, it provides on-the-job training, and it also gives them a sense of ownership. By the time they've audited the whole site, they're a real expert on their discipline, like their bit that they audited for their discipline, and they're way more likely to follow those rules in their daily work as they, continue in their careers. Number 2, recycle. So you can use the audit results to create future training materials. What I did on the FCA audit was I figured out the top 10 issue types across the sites, and I talked about those first in my training sessions. I separated issues out by discipline, and I created discipline-specific training with screenshots of the issues from the website. I took screen recordings of some of the screen reader issues, and then when there was confusing content on the website, and I showed these videos during the training. So if you do all of this mindfully while you're doing the audit, it's going to save you a lot of time. And then finally, being a team diversity opportunist. Diversity is one of those things that always makes everything better. But here I'm talking about the opportunity to augment your team. So if everyone on your team is too busy to do another accessibility review, why not try and hire someone from the outside, outside your company, and try to find a real power user. Or if you have that inside of your company, that's great too, but I always want to add to my team. So it's a great reason to get someone on board who is a power user, who uses assistive technology on a daily basis. For a part of our internal audit for FCA, we hired a developer who'd been blind since birth, and having him as part of the team during the audit was really helpful for team members. We got to take notes on his pain points as a non-sighted user, and this is real data as opposed to us sort of just imagining how it might be. You might not be able to find someone the way that we did. We heard this guy talking about what it was like to be a blind developer in a pizza place at lunch, and we just ran over and said, "Hey, do you want a part-time job? We would love to have you help us out with this audit." So that's how we met him. All right, side note, defining levels of severity and assigning them consistently. So it's gonna help you stay consistent if you define the levels of severity. So these are my definitions for priority 1, which is highest priority, so that's P1, to priority 4, which is lowest priority issue severities. And I actually make my auditors define P1 and P2 issues to keep them honest. So when I train people to go through and do the audit, if they're going to mark something as a priority 1, meaning we should fix it first, they have to let me know which piece of content is not accessible at all, like the person can't access the content at all. And for a P2, I define it as a person needs to use a significant workaround to access that content. So I make people tell me what was the workaround. When you have a big team that is doing the accessibility audit, it's really critical to make sure that they all have the same definitions for what priorities are, and it makes it a lot faster to do an overall prioritization after your audit's done. Okay, so that's it for immersive audits. On to step 3. Start with screen reader training for everyone. So why start with screen reader training? Back to the analogy of asking people to design a bike who've only ever driven a car. Teaching people to actually ride the bike before they try to design or build a bike is the key to triggering their empathy. I've done a lot of accessibility training. I used to start with a broad overview with statistics and arguments for accessibility, and then I dive into the details with discipline-specific accessibility training. And this was only moderately successful. And then one time, for one client, after all that training, I just tacked on some screen reader training at the end as an experiment. And after only an hour of trying to use the screen reader, they were all so much more engaged in learning how to do things better. They were literally begging me to remind them where I had put the other training documents so they could refer back to them. It took finally experiencing how difficult their site was to navigate themselves to make them desperately want to improve it. It really piqued their interest the way nothing else could. You want to give your team members and your clients the power to assess the accessibility of the website themselves. If you think about it, the teams really need this. You don't want to be a bottleneck, and your client needs to understand how to assess the work for accessibility so they can know whether or not they accept the work. So my automotive clients at FCA have become adept at checking our work for accessibility compliance. And this was a critical step for them because our contracts indicate that they're responsible for their own compliance. And that's normally how we do it. I assume that's probably how your clients would do it too. If there's, just as an aside, if there is some problem with doing screen reader training, you can get around it. You can just start doing demos of all of your work with the screen reader, or just key pieces of work. This shows the client that you're thinking about it, and it gives them a taste of what screen reader users will experience. So doing a before and after remediation demo of screen reader functionality can be especially helpful. So you want to, just to reiterate, you want to start with screen reader training or demos, and then next, step 4, you want to follow screen reader training with discipline-specific training. So as I was sort of getting at, teams are now primed to learn to improve experiences. They have the empathy now to understand why it's so critically important. I've found that keys to success is having a takeaway when the person leaves the training. Give them a checklist by discipline that they can use in their daily work. And then during the training, make sure that you provide real world examples. So those are the ones that you could have collected during your audit, just because, obviously a person needs to really understand what you're talking about in order to digest it and make sure that they don't make that mistake again. A little tip, during domain-specific training, you should turn common questions into blog posts. So take note of the top issues in the audit for each discipline. If you publish these as blog posts internally or externally, you'll not only be doing your regular job, but you'll be creating a profile for yourself and a body of work at the same time. And you can save time answering these questions on future projects when they're going to definitely come up again. Okay, that's all for step 4, discipline-specific training. I am going to provide some sample training schedules further on that we use for the FCA project. Okay, so workshopping the web accessibility remediation phase. Use remediation phase as an intro for your clients and team members to how to design and develop accessible content. Okay, remediation phase is challenging. You know what's wrong, but what do you want to fix first? There's a lot of different ways that you can go about it, but it's important to have a plan. Here's how we did it for FCA. We did it in this order. So step 1, we looked at web, or what I called web accessibility infrastructure elements, so sort of the scaffolding of the website. Things like, is the visible focus indicator in place? Does the global navigation menu work with the keyboard and screen reader? Does the site employ basic accessibility features? So a skip navigation link, headings, landmarks, etc. So we did those first, and it took about 20% of our effort. And this will be different for every website, right? So then step 2, we wanted to make sure that our users could perform basic tasks. So on an automotive site, you're looking at finding a dealer, checking out vehicle highlights, reading some marketing content, watching videos. You might have to talk with your UX team and your client to figure out what their critical happy path flows are, like what their basic tasks are. Again, this took us about 20% of our effort. Step 3, we started to finally delve into complex tasks and making sure that those could be performed on assistive technology. So things like vehicle configurators, the Logoizer, that's an application that they have where you can actually position an image onto a vehicle and have that, order that to be done to your car. There are a lot of highly complex interactions across the site as you get deeper into the pages. And that took about 40% of our effort. Not to say that we're done, but we're getting there. It's a journey. And then finally, step 4 is polish. And this you could define this differently. Is the user distracted by animations they can't turn off? Are there redundant alt attributes? Things like that. Things that are going to make that experience not annoying for somebody to use. So it's really important as you're planning this out and as you're remediating, each type of issue that you show your work. So I have a picture here of a doodle on a napkin. You're going to generate more interest in your work by sharing your process. Showing your work also gives you credibility, and it shows the time that goes into thinking of truly accessible solutions. So with my FCA client, we set up weekly meetings to discuss approaches for remediating accessibility issues. And I found it easier to get through the issues if we grouped like issues together. So how we did it is, if something needed a design change, basically if the experience was going to change for the mouse pointer user, or if it was going to look different, then we would go through a full workshopping. And if it didn't, if it was just going to look the same as it did before, but now it's going to work with keyboard, for example, that was easier to get an approval. And I kind of have that pictured on this slide. We fast-tracked non-design issues. So I did go through every single issue with the client, and there were hundreds of issues, but some of them I went through quickly. So if like I said, if it didn't change the design and it didn't change the mouse pointer functionality, I would just quickly provide an explanation and they would approve. And then if it did require a design change, we would go through workshopping. Now, when a design change is required, we'd have a special meeting about that. I recommend that you come to the meeting with screenshots of the proposed change in visual format so that there are no questions about how the change will look, because that's the thing they're going to be concerned about. Come to that meeting asking the question, please approve this text change, or provide alternate suggested text, or please approve the new proposed component layout, or provide feedback. Try and get all the approvals for what you're workshopping done in the meeting, just to fast track things. If your website is like the one that I had to remediate, there were lots of issues. So, you want to get this over with as quickly as possible. And also you want to be open to suggestions as part of the workshopping process. There are going to be a lot of questions that come up around, what does this success criteria mean, etc. And you'll get an opportunity to have those conversations with your client. So now we're on to step 6, and hopefully you have this organized before or early during remediation phase. So defining accessibility ownership internally and across client teams. Okay, so you don't want to be the bottleneck, okay? And you can't be the ultimate approver. So you need to get something done to fix the situation. For each discipline, you need to get buy-in from leadership that someone within the discipline needs to own responsibility for accessibility. And then you need to train that person, or better yet, train several people. I would say 2 at a minimum, so that they can cover off for each other if they're sick or on vacation. You want to have a test period, or I should have called this a trial period with an end date, where you review all of their work and provide feedback. So they're acting as the owner for accessibility, and you're checking to make sure that they're doing it right and they're not missing anything. You're training the trainer. And then after that end date, the idea would be that the lead themselves would be responsible for their work, and you would only do spot reviews. So on FCA, we're at varying places in this process. So I pretty much have the QA team at a point where I just do a spot check here and there. The UX team, I just do a spot check here and there. For the copywriting team is completely independent now. They do all of their own work, and I haven't seen any issues come up. So, it may be different for you, but, you'll get there. So this was our team of about, depending on which period of that we were working, we had between 75 and 110 people staffed to this. We had creative team, client services, myself, the accessibility lead, the QA lead, search engine optimization team, copywriters, visual designers, all the people that you need, developers to make a website. And this was our initial accessibility expertise. So myself and 3 people on my team who had been trained by me. So 4 people, not very many people. But if you look at today, so this was back in 2016. If you look at today, we have 50 people trained on the team, and 3 people are actually CPAC certified. So I'm CPAC certified, so is our QA lead, and so is one of the developers on the team. Now, I want to get to a place where everybody's trained. And I think that's where everybody and every single company needs to be. And this needs to be talked about in schools. You need to just know this information. So that's where I'm hoping to get. Teams need to be trained before they can truly own their web accessibility tasks. So I was talking about our internal team, but clients need to be trained too, so that they can be the ultimate approvers. This is what I trained the FCA team on. We did a web accessibility overview. We did some screen reader training, automated testing tool training, and then I gave them a deep dive on UX design and content, because those are the kinds of things that they involve themselves in. They don't involve themselves in any of the development, so I didn't talk with them about that. And the reason that we have to train clients is so that they don't create issues unknowingly. I'm showing a picture of a cat sitting on a laptop. We want to make sure that the client's not blocking their own process of the accessibility initiative. We don't want them, repeatedly requesting inaccessible paradigms like animations that can't be stopped, etc. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you of that. Let's move to step 7, setting up processes to test accessibility at each project phase. So each phase should have its own accessibility review. Now I'm showing kind of a traditional way of working, where there's a wireframe phase, visual design, copywriting, development. Maybe you get to work in a more agile environment, but I mean, these things are all still happening, so they should all still be reviewed, and whether or not some of them are stuck together and happening at the same time, they still need to be reviewed. In an ideal world, at this point in the process, you have accessibility ownership set up for each discipline so that these reviews can happen within a team and you're not the bottleneck. But like I mentioned, it might take a while to get there. I do believe, though, the most critical part is that everything is reviewed internally before it goes to the client. We don't want the client to see anything inaccessible and have to talk them out of it later. This is a classic scenario, right, where the design team shows them something, they think it looks amazing, and then the accessibility police come in and say, no, actually you can't do that. It's very awkward, and it makes the agency team look really fragmented. A lot of people ask me, okay, all of those reviews in place, it's going to take a lot longer. How much longer does it take to create an accessible experience? So, it varies. For a completely new and reluctant team, I would say it takes up to twice as long. For a completely new keen team, maybe it takes 1.5 times as long. But for a seasoned team, you're going to be adding about 15% of your core level of effort to your project. That's been my experience. I'm going to show you a little graph that demonstrates that as a team gets more experience, it takes them less time to make an accessible experience. But it's never going to be as quick as not doing accessibility reviews, obviously. But that's not an option. Okay, this graph shows the same thing for responsive design. So how long, we're just looking at 4 hypothetical projects here. How long a project takes is on the vertical axis. And then projects with the same amount of scope are listed, just a series of projects are listed on the horizontal axis. So I like to use, and this is talking about responsive design, I like to use this as an example because it's another scenario where new requirements were added to our project scope and we had to meet them. By the way, I hope people know what I mean by responsive design. I'm hoping it's something that we can all relate to. Does anyone else on the call remember back when we used to create experiences for a single desktop viewport? Remember that? I do. So imagine doing 4 projects for a single desktop viewport. And they have the same amount of scope. So they would have taken about the same amount of time to complete, and that's shown by this yellow thick line right here on the number 1. It takes just one time as long to do each of these projects. Okay, now, do you remember the first time your team tried to build a responsive design? So a design that worked across multiple viewport sizes. If they were like my design and dev teams, they made a lot of mistakes and it probably took twice as long. So that's represented by this white dashed line in the graph. So above project 1, you can see we're at 2. It takes twice as long the first time that we do it. The next time we did it, so here's project 2, and here's the dashed line at 1.5. So the next time we did it, we were smarter, and it only took about 1.5 times as long. And by project number 4, it takes about 15% longer. But it'll never be as fast as doing just a desktop site to do a responsive site. Okay, so from an accessibility perspective, to get to a place where it takes 15% longer, you need to have people across disciplines taking accessibility ownership, and you need to be testing accessibility at each project phase, but you can get there. Okay, on to the next step. Maintaining an accessibility issue backlog in your issue tracker. So we use Jira for my project. It's an issue tracking tool. Maybe you've heard of it or used something similar to it. And we have a label for our accessibility backlog. So what goes into there? Prioritized issues from our site-wide accessibility audit went in there. Whenever site content's updated, so whenever the team makes a new page, new code issues could be identified. So if it's a low priority issue, we can put it on the backlog. Ideally we would fix it. And for higher priority code issues, I try and get the team to fix those before launching so that they don't get put on the backlog. New issues found with component variations that weren't part of the original audit could show up in our backlog. So if your site that you're working on is as complicated as ours was, there are potentially hundreds of variations for some of the components, and I couldn't test them all in the original audit. So we still, as we author new content and use new variations, we still find issues coming up. And then also any new issues that are found by a site-wide audit tool will go in there. You want to dedicate a percentage of each release to accessibility work. We dedicate 10% at FCA. And just one of the things here is it's the client who has to decide how much of each release is being dedicated to accessibility fixes, because it's their risk that they're taking on. There needs to be people on the team with this area of expertise, so they are responsible for ensuring that. If we don't have the right people who have this expertise, we can't fix the issues. And they also have to acknowledge that this takes time. If an existing team is being asked to do this work, additionally, then the throughput of that team is going to drop. So these are the essential ingredients to maintaining a healthy accessibility backlog. Moving on to step 9. We've already talked about the specifics of training. This section is more about making that training repeatable. So I have some minimum recommended accessibility training here. I'm going to start really racing through this because I think I'm coming up to my time here. Screen reader training, obviously mandatory. You want to do that annually. So I do, high level training for each discipline. And then as issues come up, I'll also do ad hoc training. So if there's a specific issue with contrast, I'll go and teach the team all about contrast, for example. Training design considerations. You got to think about what the turnover rate is of your team, how well do they retain information, and what's your client's appetite for training, because of course they're going to be paying for the hours that are being used for training. Just a note on client accessibility training. It's a huge opportunity. It takes time and effort to put the training together initially, but it's highly reusable. I positioned this as an investment at my company. First off, we were doing it free, and now we sell it as a product. So it is a great thing to do as a company. And just as a note, screen reader training has been a really positive experience for my clients. Internal accessibility training is essential. Clients really shouldn't have to pay for an agency's time to train their staff to create accessible content. It's what they paid them to do. So agencies have to invest in designing mandatory training for their teams. But I don't know of an agency that's doing a really great job at that, and it's something that I'm working towards at Publicis Sapient. I do have some training schedules in here. I'm not going to go over them right now. You can access my deck later for years 1 and 2, because these are the 2 years that we've done training on FCA. So you can check those out later. And then finally, the last bit here, helping the client set up regular cadence for site-wide automated and manual testing. I like to use the W3's list of tools to pick from, but I do find that the best way to get all the information is to, find a subset of companies you're interested in and just call and ask for a quote and a demo. Your clients will probably be interested in these considerations here. Most of the solutions I've researched are now hosted online, but you can get ones that have local installation. Some things are priced by the number of page scans. Some things are priced by the number of licenses you want. Report formats can be different. I would love to hear if anyone's found a nice, easy, and free solution, because I haven't found one myself. Just as a note, you will need to guide your client on how to use the site-wide audit tool. Maybe they'll have some consulting hours with the person who's offering it, which would be great. They're going to want to know, what are all these errors? Do we need to log a JIRA ticket for each error? Hey, our score is 85%. Are we done? So there will be a piece of work going through that with them. Just a little note here on the types of decisions that should be documented in the accessibility policy. Again, I'm not going to go over this a lot. I just got this from W3 site, and I have the link there at the bottom. Just what I wanted to note here is that we don't write accessibility policies for our clients. We make them write them themselves. It should be something that they're driving from internally, and we don't want to assume any risk for what they've put in their policy either. Okay, so. We did it. We raced through all the 10 steps. I hope that you found something in my presentation today to help you and your client's journey towards an accessible web. We really want to get to a place where our processes allow web accessibility to just happen naturally, because again, I'm sure nobody wants to exclude anyone from content online because of how they navigate. I'd love to take any questions if we have time, and hear anything that you've done to make this journey easier. So I'm done, Rob. As I mentioned, there is an appendix to the deck that lists the top 10 most common web accessibility issues, so feel free to grab that later.
Awesome, Alison, thank you so much. Really, really good stuff there for the organizational view of accessibility. Accessibility is, yes, a technical thing, it's a design thing, but the organizational piece of it is just outrageously important. And like Alison pointed out and repeated, that is just such a key piece of this. Alison, it looks like there is a question in the chat. If you're still on.
Yeah, I'm still on. Have you ever used A/B testing? You know what? That's a great question, Ashley. We do use A/B testing. I have not used it, though, to demonstrate the impact of an accessibility issue. That's a really great idea. Thank you.
Any other questions that you want to ask here? Fire them into the chat or the QA, and then we will also keep the conversation going on Slack. Most of the speakers will touch base with the Slack site every once in a while. So we actually do have a channel, as Lisa mentioned, for questions specifically. So if anything comes up after or you don't want to ask here, then fire it into the Slack, and folks will be kind of keeping an eye on that as well. So again, Alison, thank you so much.